Now that we have Docker and our ASP.NET project set up, let's take a step back and actually look into designing our overall system. And I also want to kind of talk about the mindset slash context that you should be thinking about when you're following along with the tutorial versus when you are actually working as a software engineer. We're going to keep things pretty simple by following an n-tiered architecture. And how I usually like to start thinking about this is from the user's perspective. Let's go ahead and drag a user to our diagram. And we know this user will want to interact with some kind of recipe book. That's why they've come to our system to interact with that recipe book. So the first place they're going to be interacting with is with some kind of website or some kind of interface that they can kind of visually see and perform some kind of actions on it. So let's add that website. I'm going to add one right here. And we're just going to add some directions just to show the interaction that's going to happen. From here, we've already made a couple of assumptions about our user. We know that the user is not some kind of power user that they're going to be connecting with APIs directly to create a bunch of recipes. They're going to be interacting with some kind of interface. And then we also know that this user then will have access to the internet and have some kind of browser where they can be served up our website. These are all very obvious constraints that are implied when just thinking about a typical user. So you should always kind of know how your user will interact with our system, who your user is, just like a general idea. From here, let's start thinking about what our website does. So we know our website is going to be given a set of inputs from our user. And these inputs are then going to be triggering a series of actions that happen. So let's think about it from adding a recipe perspective. We know when the user wants to add a recipe, the website itself will not actually be saving it to some kind of database. We're then going to take the input from the user and then offload that to some kind of server. And that server is then going to perform that action. And we're going to just call that server our API server because it's going to have a bunch of APIs that the website will interact with. So let's add that to our diagram. Oops, API server. And let's just draw another arrow to that. So our API server is going to be doing a bunch of things. The first thing it's going to do is to deserialize the information coming from our website because the website is going to pass it as some kind of string JSON format and we want it in some kind of C# code. So it's going to do that serialization for you. Then it's going to validate those inputs and make sure that it's actually correct and what you are expecting it to be. And from there, it's going to perform some kind of business logic on it. So business logic, I'll explain in a little bit after we kind of go through this n-tiered architecture. After it performs the business logic, it's going to then save it to some kind of database. So in the case that we were describing earlier, where we were talking about adding a new recipe book, the user's intention is to give our systems a recipe that it wants to save and then be able to retrieve it again. So our system is going to go take inputs from the website, and then the API server is going to validate, do all of that stuff. And then the API server is then going to tell some kind of data store that this is the data I want to save for this user. Let's go ahead and add our data then. So I'm just going to drag that and then also just draw an interaction window and then just call this the database. As you can see here, we have three main tiers. We have a website, an API, and a database. These are more typically known as a presentation tier, a application/logic tier, and then a data tier. So let's actually represent that with our diagram now. I'm just going to use blocks of colors to kind of represent vertical slices of each tier. So let's do that first. I'm going to just choose this and then repeat the same thing. Now that we have our tiers well defined, let's actually walk through a typical scenario that could happen when you're starting to build a system. So when you first start out, you don't want things to be overcomplicated. So you want to first have it all on one machine. But that one machine could technically host many applications. So if you're hosting it on IIS, for example, you would host one instance of a website, and then you would then host a separate instance of an API server. And then you would have a installation of some kind of database. In this case, it's going to be a SQL server. If you then want to start scaling out your system, what you have to do is you can then take one IIS server, let's say, or website, and just move that to a separate machine. And that separate machine, it just has to be provisioned by some kind of port or some kind of DNS. And then the API server won't see any difference between what happened from it being on one machine to it being now split on multiple machines. And then you can also subsequently take the same idea and then split up our database and our API servers. Let's say we want to scale out our API server more, or let's say we want to scale out our database more. You can move those two separate machines and then increase the CPU capacity and then increase the RAM that is available. So because I like using colors and blocks to kind of represent our context, I'm going to just wrap all of this in this and just call this our n-tiered architecture, just so it's a little bit more clear. So this is our n-tier architecture. And before moving on, I just really want to re-emphasize how this whole architecture kind of works. So let's actually distinctly talk about the interactions between each tier now. So we know from the user to website, it's fairly obvious the user is going to be interacting with our presentation tier through some kind of user interface. So they're going to put some inputs in, and then they're going to click a button that then is going to interact with our website. And from the website to the API server, we know we're going to be using an HTTP protocol. And in our case specifically, we're going to be using REST. So we're going to be performing a bunch of gets, puts, posts, and deletes from the website to the API server. Finally, from the API server to the database, we're going to be using a library called Dapper. And Dapper is just a library that kind of takes abstractions from ADO.NET, which is just in charge of sending a bunch of binaries from our API server to the database. So that's kind of how the different tiers will all communicate. So we have the user interface here, we have HTTP here, and then we have Dapper here that sends the binaries to the database. Let's start focusing down on the logic and data tier and how they will actually interact with each other. Another common terminology you're going to start hearing when you want to break the tiers down is into layers. So layers are different than tiers because layers are logical constructs as opposed to tiers, which can be broken down into physical servers. So let's break our logic tier down into the different layers that it's actually going to contain. So first, let's create the logic tier context. So we will just kind of use the same colors just to make it more understandable. So this will be our logic tier here. And the first layer we're going to add is known as an application or a service layer. So I'm going to name it application layer. What this layer is in charge of is communicating from the presentation tier. So all of the routing, the HTTP protocol stuff, that's going to be all handled for us in the application layer. And you can see that the recipe book API is a representation of our application layer. But remember, they physically don't need to be separated. They just need to logically be separated. And the next layer we're going to add is our business logic layer. Let's just go ahead and do that. The business logic layer is in charge of any of the core rules that you have for the business. And we'll kind of get back to this after we add our last layer, which will be the data access layer. So let's go ahead and do that. Add our data access layer. And what the data access layer is in charge of is actually communicating with our data tier. So you can see here that the website will interact with our application layer, and the data access layer will be in charge of communicating with our data tier. So the application layer and data access layer are relatively obvious to understand, but the business logic layer is where it kind of gets a little convoluted. And usually what happens when you follow along a tutorial is the business logic layer is usually really thin because of the domain that's actually specified. And what I mean by that is usually the business logic layer will then contain just data access code. So let's say you are retrieving a recipe book. We're going to get the request on the application layer. Then that request, we can send that to a business logic layer, which will kind of isolate the code. And when you're saying get a recipe book, well, all it needs to do is to go call the data access layer, retrieve the data. Then all it does is maybe do a transform of the data to shape it to how the UI would expect it, then pass it to the application layer. A lot of the time that feels like a little over-engineered, but when we start thinking about our business domain more complexly than just a simple CRUD application, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So let's take our recipe book example and actually transform it. So in most cases, when you're working for a company or even when you're starting out your own company, you want to think about how the company will actually make money. You want to think about the revenue stream. In the recipe book scenario, let's say we want to add a subscription model to limit the number of recipes that a user is allowed to create. So we would have a $5 tier that limits them to 30 recipes, a $10 tier that limits them to 100 recipes. Now let's say our user is a part of the $5 subscription plan, so they're allowed to make 30 recipes, and they have decided to add a new recipe. Now, when it goes to the business logic layer, the business logic layer can no longer just simply save to the database. They now have to verify a couple of things. The first being whether or not this user has already added the 30 recipes or not. And if they have, then they have to be told, sorry, you cannot add a new recipe. And if they haven't, then they can continuously add until they hit that limit. Because now we know there's a limit, there's probably going to be some kind of reporting behind it. So every time a user adds a new recipe, we're going to have to then tell a report for their subscription plan, oh, you have about 5 more recipes before you're full. So now the data access layer will add a new recipe, then add something to report, and then you can kind of see how it will kind of get more complex as you kind of start thinking about, oh, this person is paying for something. How are they going to then see what they're paying for? So let's say all of that is working really well, but we have a business analyst the next week coming to us saying, oh, our revenues are down because every time someone hits their 30 recipe limit, they're not actually doing anything different. They're just sitting on that. So they want to add another rule that says instead of saying, sorry, you can't add a new recipe, on the second try, they want to add, do you want to upgrade to your $10 plan instead? Let's walk through the scenario where the users hit their limit again. So they click save and the business logic layer needs to verify whether or not they have hit their limit. And if they have, then it needs to additionally track whether or not this user has seen this state before. So we would then make a call to the data access layer to save that state that the user has hit their limit and they've now saved for the first time. So that when the user then clicks save the second time, we verify in the business logic layer that they have hit their limit and now they have saved it for the second time. So instead of returning, sorry, you cannot save, we would then tell the user, hey, would you like to upgrade to the $10 plan instead? As you can see, it can kind of get complicated really fast once you start thinking about revenue. But in a tutorial, we're just going to keep things really simple. But I hope that really helped with the mindset of how to think about it from a tutorial perspective to when you're actually starting to work. So now let's actually go to Visual Studio and try to construct our different layers. What I'm going to do is now full screen Visual Studio. We're going to try a couple of different approaches and we're just going to do a bunch of pseudocode to kind of demonstrate that. The first approach is we're going to have all of our layers within the same project and just to kind of see how that's going to be. So the first thing we need is going to be our recipe controller. So let's add an empty recipe controller. We can kind of see how that would work. Zoom in a bit so you guys can see. Let's just start writing a bunch of pseudocode. So the first thing we want to do is, let's say we want to save the recipe book. So let's say I action result. I'll cover more in depth of what these actual things are for the controller in the actual controller video. Let's say add new recipe. And then we're going to need a recipe model to actually save that data somewhere. So let's do that. And then we're going to just generate that recipe model. And let's do that. And then what we want to do is we want to return to the user that everything is okay. And let's just add a, let's say title of the recipe just for now. So let's construct our different layers. So we're going to have let's have a class that can save our business logic. And we'll have a class. Save our data access. So we have our different little pieces now. Now let's add our code to actually perform some actions. So public void save recipe to database. And I guess it will expect the recipe model. And we'll just comment to say save to database. And now the business logic, let's do the same thing. Save recipe. And we'll do this, the recipe model. Like that. And then validate stuff. And call the data access code. So since we actually have the data access code, let's actually do that. Okay. And data access dot save. We're just going to pass that recipe book down. Same thing. We're going to make this a void. Thing up here. We're going to then say business logic. And we're going to say business logic dot save recipe. Now that we have all our layers here, we can kind of see it's a little silly to kind of have them all here because one of the key things about having that logical separation is that we can actually put them into different places. so that when we want to see business logic code, we have business logic code where it needs to be. When we want to see data access code is where it needs to be. And right now, they're all living on the controller. So they're all actually living logically where the application layer is. Let's start cleaning up and finding a better way to organize everything by moving them all to their little separate folders. So the first one we want to do is probably move our models to a separate folder. So let's do that. Let's say we want to have a models folder. Close that. And let's copy our recipe model over. All right. And then we're just going to just copy everything here and paste that in there. And then we can delete our models. And now all we have to do is resolve the namespace here. And we're back to where we were. Next, let's move our data access to its own little folder. So let's take that, add a folder called data access. And then we can just copy this and move it in there as well. So rather than calling the data access for recipe, just data access again, let's be more verbose and call it recipe data access. And we'll copy that method that we had inside of our recipe data access. Resolve namespaces. And back to the controller we go. And then now we can clear this away and actually resolve this, the recipe data access. Perfect. Now let's move our business logic out of here as well. So create a folder called business logic. Once again, create a class called recipe business logic and copy that method out. Resolve namespaces. Perfect. And then back here, now we can delete our business logic here and resolve as recipe. And then resolve that namespace. Now we can see everything's a little bit more clean in our application layer. We have a distinct business logic layer and we have a distinct data access layer. So anytime we want to see anything with data access related stuff, we would go here. Anytime we want to see any routes, any URLs or anything, we would go here. Anytime we want to see any of our rules for our business, we would go here. This is very important as the application actually starts to grow, because from the previous example, let's say we started adding reporting, we wanted to add our billing, we wanted to add that subscription model concept. Just imagine it starts to grow and grow and grow. We start to have a bunch of different places. And if we had it originally where we had it here, our one controller would start growing to like a 10,000 line file. And all the other developers who have to work on that application to maintain it would really hate their lives. So you could stop here and leave everything within the same project, or you can further isolate them to an actual separate project. And there's a couple of different reasons why you would want to do that. Sometimes you want to keep your abstractions in one place and your implementations in another place. But in general, for organization's sake, I think it's a little bit easier if everything that is not ASP.NET Core related is moved out, and everything that you need to actually interact with the business logic and data access is actually just passed in through the controller. So let's do one more final refactoring and kind of get everything a little bit more organized for our final project. Let's make a new class library. So here I'm going to choose class library for .NET Core. We're going to click next. And what I'm going to call it is recipe book.service library. You can realistically name it whatever you want as long as it's consistent and everyone kind of understands what the purpose is for. In our case, the service library is going to contain business logic and data access and any kind of the kernels and infrastructure stuff that it's going to require. So let's create that. Let's move over our business logic and data access stuff over now. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to actually add a folder for our model. But instead of calling it model, I actually like to refer to the model that's going to be used for the database object as an entity. So entities. And then I'm going to add a recipe entity. Recipe entity. And that recipe entity is going to be exactly what this is, except for just renamed. Let's add that in here. And additionally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the name of the business logic to a domain, because I like to think about things from a domain perspective. So we're going to go domain. And also, if you notice, I like to use plurals for the overarching folders and singular for the subsequent classes. I think the main important thing is that you're consistent and not to be too picky about how you actually do it. But as long as everyone does it the same way, then that's the most important part. Let's move over our recipe. So recipe, and this is going to contain our business logic. And then let's move over the data access. So the data access, I'm going to be using something called the repository pattern. So because of that, I'm going to be at repositories, and let's add a recipe repository. So same. And now let's just copy over all of the stuff we had earlier. So we know this, copy this. So save recipe to database, copy this to our repository. We're going to make this public. And now we know that we named this to entity. So let's resolve namespace. I'm going to call this go. And then let's move over our domain. So let's take this and copy over the business logic. Save that in this, same thing, rename this. Okay, and also we want to change this. And then our data access, we want to change as well. So recipe repository. And I'm going to follow our naming convention renaming and this repository. And finally, let's go to our recipe controller. Just change this. We will actually need to add a reference first. Sorry, we'll add reference to our service library into our API. So let's do that. Now that we have that, we should be able to just resolve that. And we can now clean up all the clutter on our application layer. So up. So now you can see that our application layer is nice and organized and our service layer is nice and organized. One thing first is we actually got to fix this as well. So entity, resolve the namespace, solve this. Okay, and then change this and fix all the using statements. Now that we have everything nice and organized, let's actually set a debugger and also make a few modifications so we can actually get to the debugger. So I'm going to make this into a get so that we can just open it in our browser. And I'm additionally going to make this from query just so that the browser is okay with accepting this as an input. So let's hit F5, or if you want, you can click this to start Visual Studio. So we have our browser open and we're going to just navigate to API/recipe and press enter. And it will come to our debugging point. So we're going to create a business logic class. And then it's going to tell the business logic we want to do some saving, perform some kind of validation. So this is where you would check the subscription, check if they hit their limit, check if they've already previously hit this limit. And then it would create a repository. The repository will tell the database to do the saving of the data. So in our case, we have a nice little comment that says save to database. So let's go back to the user, and in the application layer, all it does is tells the user, hey, this request was okay. In our browsers, because it returned okay, we have a nice blank screen. In a real world scenario, obviously you would use dependency injection to kind of give you the business logic, and same thing here, you would use dependency injection to give you the repository. But I hope this was very clear to kind of show you how you can kind of separate out your different layers. And if you really want to have further abstraction, you can actually move your entity and repository to its own separate class library and have a recipe book, data access, or repositories. That is the end of this design portion. I hope you guys were able to understand a little bit better how the entire architecture works. And we took an iterative approach today by kind of explaining the concept, building out something very simple, and then kind of refactoring that to be a little bit more organized, along with the different mindset between working from a tutorial to actually working from something in real life. As always, if you guys learned something from this, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and stay tuned for the next part. I'll see you guys next time.